The letter arrived on a Tuesday. No return address. No stamp. Just a name written in careful, deliberate ink across the front of the envelope. Clara Hendricks. As if whoever wrote it had taken their time. As if the name itself meant something to them. Clara almost didn't open it. She had been standing at the window of her one-room boarding house in Abilene, Kansas, watching the dust rise from the main street like smoke from something that had already burned to the ground. She was 26 years old. She had $11 to her name, and she hadn't received a letter from anyone in over 2 years. So she opened it. Inside was a job offer. Clean. Simple. A rancher in the territory of New Mexico needed a caretaker for his injured son, a boy of 9 named Thomas. The pay was generous. More generous than anything Clara had seen in her years of working as a nurse's assistant, a seamstress, a laundress. The rancher's name was written at the bottom. Elias Cutter. She didn't know that name. She didn't know that ranch. She didn't know anything about the wide, red desert country waiting for her 300 miles to the southwest. But she packed her bag that same evening. What Clara didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that Elias Cutter knew exactly who she was, that the letter wasn't chance, that the boy named Thomas had a secret buried under his quiet eyes and careful smile, and that somewhere in the dark of that ranch house, a man was reading her words by candlelight every single night. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Sending love your way. This is a story about what hides behind silence, about the things we carry without knowing anyone is watching, and about the moment when everything we thought was ordinary reveals itself to be something else entirely. Stay with me. The stagecoach dropped her at the edge of nothing. That was how Clara would describe it later, when she had words for it. The driver pulled the horses to a stop, told her this was as far as the line ran, and pointed southwest toward a smear of brown hills barely visible through the afternoon haze. She stepped down into the dust with her single carpet bag and a hatbox that had seen better decades, and she stood there watching the coach roll away until it became a dark speck and then became nothing at all. The desert in late September was quieter than she expected. Clara had grown up in Missouri. She knew rivers and green fields and the smell of mud after rain. She knew towns with church steeples and neighbors who hollered to each other across fences. But this country, this wide, copper-colored land of flat rock and dry brush and sky that went on forever, this was something different, something older. Like the land itself had been here before people had any business being here, and it was still deciding whether to tolerate them. She had been told a man would meet her with a horse. He was not there. She waited an hour. She counted the hawks circling above the distant hills. 3 of them, patient and unhurried. She drank from her canteen. She read Elias Cutter's letter one more time, though she had already memorized it. The words were simple and plain, the handwriting deliberate. A man who chose each word carefully, who didn't waste ink. Told her the job. Told her the pay. It told her Thomas had broken his leg badly in a fall from a horse 3 months prior, that the bone had mended but the boy refused to walk, refused to try, and the ranch had no woman in it and no tenderness in it, and a child needed both. That last line had stayed with her. A child needs both. It was not the kind of thing she expected from a rancher. Ranchers wrote about livestock and weather and water rights. They did not write about tenderness. So she had read that line 3 times on the stagecoach, and she had wondered about the man who wrote it, and then she had told herself to stop wondering and focus on the job. The man who came for her was not Elias Cutter. He arrived 40 minutes late on a gray horse with a cracked saddle. A Mexican vaquero named Santos with a white mustache and eyes that had seen everything and reacted to none of it. He nodded at her bag. She handed it up. He produced a second horse from behind his own, a brown mare, steady and thick-legged, and helped her up without a word. They rode for 2 hours through country that changed slowly. Scrub brush, red rock formations rising from the earth like broken teeth. A dry riverbed that wound through the landscape like the memory of water. Santos said almost nothing, but once, when the trail curved around a boulder and the ranch came into view for the first time. A collection of low adobe buildings set against a ridge of dark hills, pale smoke rising from a chimney, he said quietly, It is a lonely place, but Senor Cutter keeps it honest. Clara didn't know what that meant. She filed it away. The ranch hands who moved between the buildings barely glanced at her when she rode in. One man was mending a fence. Another was carrying a bucket from the well. They had the look of men who did their work and kept their thoughts in their boots. The main house was larger than she'd imagined. Long and low, with a covered porch running the length of the front, and a door that stood open to catch the last of the afternoon breeze. A boy appeared in the doorway. He was smaller than she expected for 9. Dark-haired, pale for the desert, with serious eyes that studied her the way a person studies something they've been thinking about for a long time. He was leaning on a wooden crutch, his left leg visible beneath his rolled trouser cuff. Thin and slightly curved, still mending, still carrying the signature of a break that had been bad. He looked at her. She looked at him. "You're Miss Hendricks," he said. It wasn't a question. "I am," she said, climbing down from the mare. "And you must be Thomas." He nodded slowly. Then he looked past her, toward the trail she had ridden in on, and something shifted in his face. A small shadow, gone before she could name it. "My father's not here," he said. "He's out on the South Range. He'll be back before supper." "That's fine," Clara said. "I'm not in any hurry." The boy looked at her again with those careful old eyes. "He said you would say that," he said quietly. She stopped. "He said I would say what?" "That you're not in any hurry." Thomas tilted his head slightly. "He said that's what you're like. Patient." Clara stood still for a moment in the cooling late afternoon air, with the dust settling around her boots and the hawks still circling somewhere above. A man she had never met had told his son what she was like. A man who had written her a letter out of the bare blue sky had described her character to a 9-year-old child with serious eyes. She smiled at Thomas because smiling was the thing to do. But inside, something small and careful had woken up. A question that didn't have a shape yet. A feeling like standing at the edge of a room and realizing the room is larger than the door suggested. "Why don't you show me where I'll be staying?" she said. Thomas turned on his crutch and moved back into the house, slow and deliberate. Clara followed him into the shadows. And somewhere out on the South Range, beyond the hills, a man on a black horse pulled his animal to a stop and stood very still for a long moment, looking back toward the smoke rising from his chimney. Then he turned and kept riding. He came in just before sundown. Clara heard the horse first. A single set of hooves, unhurried, coming around the side of the house to the stable. Then she heard Santos speaking in low Spanish, and another voice answering. Deeper, quieter. A man's voice that didn't carry but somehow still filled the air. She was in the kitchen, heating the soup that the ranchers cook. An ancient woman named Dora, who left at 4 in the afternoon and didn't talk to anyone, had left on the stove. Thomas was at the table behind her, watching her with the particular stillness of a child who has learned to be quiet in a house full of quiet adults. She heard boots on the porch steps. Then the door. She turned. Elias Cutter was not what she expected. She had built a picture of him during the 2-week journey. A thick, weathered man, barrel-chested, with the blunt face of someone who dealt in cattle and contracts and didn't think much beyond either. The way men in that territory tended to look. Hard and permanent, like the landscape made flesh. Elias was tall, yes, and weathered. She could see that immediately in the deep lines around his eyes and the sun-browned leather of his forearms below rolled sleeves. But he was leaner than her imagination, and younger, 40 perhaps, or close to it, and there was something careful in how he moved. Deliberate, measured, as if he thought about each step before taking it. He stopped inside the doorway and looked at her. He did not smile, but his eyes, dark gray, the color of storm clouds over the hills, moved over her face with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. It was not the way men usually looked at women who had just arrived at their homes. It was more like recognition, like confirming something he had already known. "Miss Hendricks," he said. "Mr. Cutter," she said. A silence. Ordinary length, but it felt longer. "You made good time," he said. "The stagecoach ran on schedule." He nodded. moved to the wash basin in the corner, and washed his hands without looking at her. She turned back to the soup. Thomas, she noticed, was watching his father with careful eyes. Supper was simple. Beef soup and cornbread and coffee strong enough to wake the dead. They ate at the long kitchen table, the three of them, and the sound of spoons and the crackle of the stove fire were the loudest things in the room for a while. Elias asked his son about the day in short, quiet questions. Thomas answered in short, quiet answers. Clara observed. What she observed was this: Elias Cutter was a man who loved his son. It was not loud love. It was not the kind of love that made noise or demanded witness. It was visible in the way he looked at the boy when Thomas wasn't watching. A look that was almost painful in its directness, as if the man was trying to memorize him, as if he was afraid of forgetting. After supper, Elias poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of Clara without asking. Santos said you waited an hour at the road, he said. It was all right. It wasn't. He was supposed to be there when the stage came through. I'll speak to him. Please don't, Clara said. The wait didn't trouble me. Elias looked at her. You said that like you mean it. I do mean it. He was quiet for a moment. Then something shifted in his expression. Something subtle and brief, like a door opening a half-inch and then catching. What did Thomas tell you? He said. Before I came in. He told me you said I would be patient, Clara said, keeping her voice even. I'd like to know how you knew that. Elias wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. His knuckles were scarred, the kind of scars that came from a lifetime of physical work and from at least a few moments of violence. He said, You wrote letters to Reverend Calloway in Abilene. About the families you helped nurse. He's a friend of mine. He let me read them. Clara was still. Not without his telling me they were private, Elias said quickly. He told me. I still read them. I won't pretend otherwise. He looked at her directly. You have a way of describing people that makes them real. You wrote about an old man dying of lung fever who was afraid his wife would sell his horses. You sat with him 3 nights and told him stories about his horses until he stopped being afraid. You wrote about that like it was nothing. Like it was just what you did. Clara said nothing. It's not nothing, Elias said. The fire crackled. That's why I wrote you, he said. Thomas needs someone who thinks that kind of thing is nothing. Because for him to walk again, it isn't going to be about his leg. The leg has healed. Dr. Marsh says there's no reason he can't bear weight. But Thomas won't try. He paused. He stopped trying when his mother died. The word died came out flat and plain, the way only men who have practiced saying a thing can make it come out. When? Clara asked quietly. 8 months ago. February. He drank his coffee. The fall from the horse was in June. Whether the one caused the other, I don't know. Thomas won't say. He stood up then, with the decisive movement of a man ending a conversation before it could ask more of him than he'd budgeted for. Your room is at the end of the hall, he said. Thomas will show you tomorrow. Good night, Miss Hendricks. He left. Clara sat at the table with her coffee cooling in her hands. She thought about letters, about what it meant for a man to seek out your private words and read them before he ever met your face, about a boy who wouldn't walk, about a February that had changed everything in this quiet house. She thought about that look in Elias Cutter's eyes. Recognition, that's what it was. As if she was someone he had already decided to trust. In the first week, Clara learned Thomas. That was how she thought of it. Not getting to know him the way you got to know a neighbor or a colleague, with pleasantries and small facts traded over time. Learning Thomas was something closer to learning a landscape. You had to move through it slowly. You had to notice what was there before you started asking why. He was smart. Sharper than most adults in the room, but he had learned to keep that hidden, the way animals in open country learn to go still. He read anything he could get hold of, newspapers, seed catalogs, a battered copy of Treasure Island that had been read so many times the cover was soft as cloth. He could recite the names and locations of every river in the New Mexico territory. He knew the names of the stars visible from the porch in October and could find the ones with no names and make up names for them on the spot. He was funny, too, quietly funny. the dry kind that crept up on you. But he wouldn't walk. Every morning after breakfast, Clara would sit with him on the porch or in the small room off the main hall that served as a kind of sitting room. She changed his dressings, though the wound needed little now, and she read to him and talked to him and played cards with him, and never once, in that first week, mentioned walking or legs or the crutch leaning against the wall. She watched him watch the ranch through the window. She watched him watch his father cross the yard in the mornings, riding out, and return in the evenings, riding back. There was something in the way Thomas tracked his father's movements, constant, almost anxious, that told her more than any question could have. On the 8th day, she asked him about his mother. They were on the porch. The desert afternoon was doing what desert afternoons did. Burning slow and orange, shadows going long, the air beginning to cool at its edges. Thomas had a piece of rope he'd been braiding absently. He stopped braiding. "Her name was Marguerite," he said. "But my father called her Maggie. Nobody else was allowed to call her that." "What was she like?" Thomas thought for a long moment. He had the habit, she'd noticed, of not answering until he had the right words, a patience unusual in children, more common in the very old. "She laughed loud," he said finally. "For someone so small, she laughed real loud. My father used to say you could hear her laughing from the South Range." He paused. "After she got sick, the house got very quiet. I think he was trying to keep it quiet for her. And after it stayed quiet," Thomas said simply. "For different reasons." Clara let that sit. "Do you know why you won't walk?" she asked. Not accusingly. The same way she might ask if he knew what the weather was going to do. Thomas looked at his hands. The rope, the braid he'd made and unmade twice already. "If I walk," he said slowly, "then nothing is wrong with me anymore." He didn't look at her. "And if nothing is wrong with me, then my father doesn't need to worry about me." He turned the rope over in his hands. "And if he doesn't need to worry about me, he'll just be alone with the quiet." Clara was still. It took her a moment to fully understand what she had just heard. A 9-year-old boy had broken his own future to give his father something to take care of. Had made himself the thing that kept his father tethered to the world. Had done it consciously or unconsciously. She wasn't sure which was more heartbreaking. She said, "Thomas, your father loves you for more than you're needing him." "I know that," the boy said, with a matter-of-factness that broke her heart clean in half. "But he doesn't know what to do with himself when he isn't taking care of something." He looked up at her then, and for just a moment, she saw the exhaustion in him. The weight of being 9 years old and carrying the emotional architecture of a grown man's grief. "He reads," Thomas said, and then he stopped, as if he'd said something he hadn't meant to. "What does he read?" The boy was quiet for a long moment. His eyes went to the yard, then very carefully back to Clara. "Your letters," he said. "The ones you wrote to Reverend Calloway. He has copies. He reads them at night, by the candle in his study. I've seen the light under the door." The world went very quiet around Clara. The cooling desert air. The distant sound of cattle somewhere. The creak of the porch boards in the faint evening wind. "He reads your letters every night," Thomas said. Not like it was a secret he was spilling carelessly. Like it was something he had decided very deliberately to tell her. "Even before you came. For months. He would read them and then sit there for a long time not doing anything." Thomas looked at her with his serious old eyes. "I don't know why I'm telling you. I just thought you should know." Clara stood up. Slowly. She gripped the porch railing and looked out at the desert, at the long shadows of early evening stretching across the red ground. She thought about a man sitting alone in a room by candlelight, reading the words of a woman he hadn't met yet, sitting with them, carrying them the same way she'd carried his letter on the stagecoach, reading it again and again, finding something in the words she hadn't expected to find. She thought, "What is this place I've come to?" She thought, "What is this house?" The sun dropped behind the hills. The desert turned purple and then gray. And in the main house, a door opened and closed, and the sound of boots on the wooden floor moved through the wall at her back. Elias Cutter was home. She didn't say anything to him. Not that night, not the next. Clara was not a woman who moved without thinking. She had learned, in hospital wards and sick rooms and boarding houses and all the other tight, difficult spaces where she'd spent her adult life, that the most important thing you could do when you discovered something unexpected was to go still. To watch. To let the thing reveal itself more fully before you decided what it meant. So she watched. She paid attention to the architecture of Elias Cutter's evenings. He came in at sundown. He ate. He spent an hour with Thomas, helping him with arithmetic or listening to the boy read aloud, or simply sitting near him in companionable silence. Then he said good night. Then he went to his study. The study was at the far end of the hallway, past the room where Clara slept, past a closed door she had been told was a room that used to be Marguerite's sewing room. The study door was always closed, and every night, somewhere around 9 or 10 o'clock, she would see the thin thread of candlelight beneath it. She did not press her ear to the door. She was not that kind of woman, but she began to lie awake in her bed in the dark, in the quiet desert night, thinking about what it meant. A man who had sought out her private words before seeking her out in person, who had described her character to his son before she arrived, who looked at her like someone confirming what he had already believed. It should have felt like intrusion. It should have felt like violation. Didn't. And that troubled her more than anything else. On the 11th night, she was in the kitchen at 10 o'clock, heating milk because sleep wasn't coming, and she heard the study door open. Footsteps in the hall. Then the sound of them stopping. She turned. Elias stood in the doorway of the kitchen. He was in his shirt sleeves, no vest, no hat, undone in the way that men only allowed themselves to be undone when they thought no one was watching. He stopped when he saw her. Something moved in his face and then settled back into stillness. "I heard the stove," he said. "Couldn't sleep," she said. "Can I make you some?" A pause. Then, "All right." He sat down at the kitchen table. She heated a second cup. She set it in front of him and sat across from him, and for a while they sat there like two people on opposite sides of a river, figuring out if there was a crossing. "Thomas told me something," she said. She'd decided, in the 30 seconds it took the milk to heat, to be direct. She was not accustomed to games, and she suspected neither was he. Elias wrapped his hands around the cup. His jaw moved once. "What did he tell you?" "About the letters." The silence that followed was long and thick. Outside, coyotes were calling somewhere in the dark hills. The candle on the kitchen shelf threw warm, unsteady light. Elias looked at his hands. "I would have told you myself," he said. "Eventually." "I'm not angry," Clara said. "I want to understand." He looked up. "Understand what?" "Why? Why a man who needs a caretaker for his son reads her letters for months before he writes to her. Why you knew what I was like before you met me. Why you told Thomas." She kept her voice even. "What were you looking for?" He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "Reverend Calloway wrote to me after Maggie died. He was trying to be kind. He mentioned there was a woman in his congregation in Abilene who had a gift for sitting with people in pain. He said you wrote him letters about the work, descriptions of people, their fears, the small things you did to help them through. He offered to share them. And you said yes." "I said yes." He turned the cup in his hands. "The first one I read, you wrote about a girl who was afraid to die because she thought God wouldn't recognize her. You sat with her and made a list of everything specific about her. Her favorite food, the sound of her laugh, the way she mispronounced a word she'd only ever read, never heard. You read her the list and you told her that any God worth believing in would recognize all of those things." He paused. "I read that 3 times. Clara was quiet. "Thomas was drowning," Elias said. "After Maggie died, he stopped being Thomas. He started being this still, small, careful version of himself. And I couldn't reach him. I didn't know how." The line of his jaw went tight. "I know cattle. I know land. I know how to fix what's broken if I can see where it's broken. Thomas. I couldn't see where it was broken. But you thought I could. I thought you might know how to sit with a person in the dark without needing to fix them immediately." He looked at her. Directly. "I was right." Something in Clara's chest moved. She picked up her cup. drank, steadied herself. "You should have told me the truth from the start," she said. "In the letter." "Yes," he said, without defense or excuse. "Just, yes. Why didn't you?" He looked at her for a long moment. The candlelight moved. The coyotes called again, farther away now, or maybe closer. The desert had a way of making distance hard to judge. "Because I wasn't sure you'd come," he said quietly. "And I needed you to come." He stood up then, took his cup to the basin, washed it the way he did everything, carefully, completely, without waste of motion. At the doorway he stopped. "I'm glad you came, Miss Hendricks," he said. He walked back down the hall. She heard the study door. She heard the quiet that followed. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time, and she thought about what it meant to be needed, and what it meant to be seen, and how those two things could arrive in your life wearing the face of a stranger and leave wearing the face of something else entirely. 3 weeks after Clara arrived at Cutter Ranch, on a cold Thursday morning with the smell of early winter coming off the hills, Thomas stood up from his chair and took 5 steps across the porch floor. He didn't warn her. He didn't announce it or make a thing of it. She had gone inside to refill the coffee, and when she came back, he was standing, the crutch leaning against the railing where he had set it deliberately, carefully, as though placing a thing he was not going to need anymore, and he was walking. 5 slow steps. His face was turned away from her. His hands were out at his sides for balance, fingers spread. He stopped at the porch railing, put his hands on it, looked out at the yard. Clara stood in the doorway and did not say anything. After a moment, Thomas said, without turning, "It doesn't hurt." "No," she said. "Dr. Marsh said it wouldn't." "I know what Dr. Marsh said." He was quiet. The morning wind moved through the scrub brush at the edge of the yard. A hawk was making slow circles above the ridge. "I just wanted to check if he was right." Clara set the coffee down on the small table by the door. She came to stand beside him at the railing. They looked out at the yard together, the stable, the water trough, a ranch hand moving between 2 buildings in the far distance. "Are you going to tell your father?" she asked. Thomas thought about it. "Tonight," he said, "at supper. I want to walk into the kitchen. On my own. No crutch." His voice was steady, but his hands on the railing were gripping hard. Clara looked at his profile. The serious dark eyes, the thin shoulders, the jaw set in that stubborn, careful way that was entirely Elias Cutter's. She had spent 3 weeks learning this child, and now she understood him the way you understood something you had read and reread. Not just the surface meaning but the structure beneath. "Thomas," she said gently, "your father will still need you after this." The boy's hands loosened on the railing. Just a fraction. "He has you now," Thomas said. It was said plainly. Not with calculation, not with hope, not with any special weight. It was the observation of a child who had decided that a certain thing was true and saw no reason not to say it. Clara was very careful with her response. "I work for your father," she said. "That's all." Thomas turned his head and looked at her with that patient, aged expression. "He put the letters in a folder," he said. "A brown leather folder with his initials on it. He has it on his desk. Not in a drawer. On his desk." "Thomas?" "I just thought that was a thing worth knowing," he said, and turned back to looking at the yard. That evening, at supper, something happened in that kitchen that Clara would remember for the rest of her life. Elias came in just before 6. He washed his hands. He turned from the basin and Thomas was standing in the center of the kitchen floor. No crutch. Both feet on the ground. Head up. What Elias did in that moment was not what you might expect from a man who had been carved by this land into something hard and economical. He did not cheer. He did not make exclamations. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and went to his knees in front of his son and put both hands on the boy's shoulders and looked at him. Just looked at him with an expression so raw and unguarded that Clara turned away to give them the privacy of it. She heard Thomas say, quietly, "I'm okay, Pop," and she heard Elias say, in a voice she had not heard from him before, lower, rougher, worn down to the fiber of it, "I know, son. I know you are." She busied herself at the stove. When she turned back, Elias was standing again. He had his hand on the back of Thomas's neck, gently, the way you hold something precious. He looked across the room at Clara. She had prepared herself for the moment. She had thought, he will nod. He will say thank you. He is a man of small gestures and careful expressions. He didn't nod. He held her gaze for a long moment. Long enough to be deliberate, long enough to cross from gratitude into something else. And his eyes said the thing that his voice apparently could not yet manage. Not in front of the boy. Not with supper on the stove and the ordinary world still running around them. Clara looked away first. They ate. Thomas talked more than usual. A release of some held pressure, some long-stored energy finally given permission to move. He told them about a spider he'd observed on the porch railing for 3 days. He talked about Treasure Island and where he thought the treasure was really buried. He ate 2 helpings of beef stew and half a pan of Dora's cornbread. Elias watched his son talk and eat and exist, and the expression on his face was something Clara had no word for. Relief was too small. Joy was too bright. It was quieter than either. It was the expression of a man who had stood at the edge of losing something and felt the ground steady under his feet again. Later, doing the dishes, Clara heard Elias come to stand in the kitchen doorway. "Miss Hendricks," he said. She kept washing. "Mr. Cutter, I'd like to ask you something." She turned, her hands still wet. "All right." He was standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands, turning it once, twice, the only sign of anything unsteady in him. He looked at her carefully, the way he had looked at her that very first evening, confirming something he had already believed. "Would you stay?" he said. "Past the month we agreed on. Longer. If you were willing." Clara dried her hands. Outside, in the dark desert, the coyotes were singing again. She said she would think about it. She spent 2 days thinking. She took long walks in the early morning, before the ranch stirred, moving out into the desert along the trail that curved around the back of the property toward a rocky overlook where you could see 40 miles in every direction. She had found this place in her second week and claimed it, the way you claim a place that feels like it has been waiting for you. She sat on a flat rock and watched the sun come up over the eastern hills, slow and enormous, turning the desert from gray to gold, and she thought about her life before the letter arrived. $11. A boarding house room, the particular quiet of a life that was functional but not inhabited. She had been good at her work and empty around the edges of it. She had filled the emptiness with letter writing, with the careful description of other people's lives, with the close attention she paid to strangers in extremity. She had poured herself into other people's stories because her own felt like a draft. Unfinished, not yet committed to the page. She thought about that. On the second morning, she came back from the overlook to find Elias on the porch. He was not waiting for her, or rather, he was not visibly waiting. He was sitting in one of the straight-backed porch chairs with a coffee cup, looking out at the yard. But she'd spent enough time with a man who was economical in everything to recognize that he was not there by accident. She sat down in the other chair. For a while, neither of them spoke. The desert morning was cold and still, the sky pale blue, the hills in the distance outlined in sharp, clean light. "I want to show you something," he said. He stood and went inside. She followed. He led her to the study. She had never been inside and unlocked the door. The room was small and crowded with the organized clutter of a working rancher. Ledger books, maps on the walls, a rifle in the corner. The desk was solid and heavy, covered with papers. And in the center of the desk, clearly placed there with intention rather than habit, was a brown leather folder with the initials EC pressed into the cover. He picked it up. He held it out to her. She took it. Inside were the letters. Her letters. 14 of them. She counted automatically the way she cataloged everything. They were not copies, she realized after a moment. They were originals. Reverend Calloway had given them to him. The paper was soft with handling, the creases worn, each letter folded and refolded so many times the paper had gone limp at the folds like cloth. She opened the one on top. It was the one Elias had mentioned, the girl who was afraid of dying. She read the first paragraph and felt strange, the way you always feel reading your own old words. Slightly foreign, slightly younger, slightly more raw than you remember being. "What do you see?" Elias said. "When you read those?" "A version of myself from 2 years ago," she said. "What I see," he said, "is someone who was so busy taking care of the world that she forgot to ask anyone to take care of her." Clara was still. "That's an observation," he said quickly. "Not an accusation." "I know," she said. She put the letters back into the folder, closed it, set it carefully back on the desk. She stood with her hands on the cover for a moment, feeling the worn leather under her fingers. "I was lonely," she said. "If that's what you mean." "Yes," he said. "I know." The letters said that. Not directly, but they said it. "And you?" she said. She turned to look at him. "Are you lonely, Mr. Cutter?" He looked back at her without flinching, without deflecting. It was one of the things about him she had come to understand. He did not look away from hard things. He had learned, at some cost, to stay present with difficulty. "I was," he said. "February through September. I was the loneliest man in New Mexico." He paused. "Then I started reading your letters. And it was different. The quiet was still there. But it had something in it." Clara understood that. She understood it in her chest, in the particular place where she kept things that were too precise and fragile for words. The way a voice could make silence feel inhabited rather than empty. The way someone's words could be company even without their presence. She thought about him in this room, candle burning, her letters spread on the desk. 14 evenings of sitting with her words in the dark of this desert house. She thought about letters as a kind of longing, a reaching toward. "I'll stay," she said. Something in the room changed, pressure, temperature, she couldn't name it. Elias looked at her as though she had said something that took the weight from him. Not all of it, not permanently, just enough to let him stand differently. "Thank you," he said. "I have conditions," she said. His mouth, for the first time since she had arrived, shifted into something that was almost a smile. "I expected that," he said. "What are they?" "Thomas walks to school in the spring. There's a schoolhouse in the next town, Santos told me. I want him there." "Done." "I write letters," she said. "It's how I think. I won't stop. I wouldn't ask you to." "And you," she said. "If you want to know something about me, you ask me directly. Not through Reverend Calloway, not through a letter I didn't know you were reading. You ask me." Elias held her gaze. "That's fair," he said. "Good," she said. She moved toward the door. "Miss Hendricks," he said. She paused. "I have a condition too," he said. She turned. He was looking at her with those gray eyes, steady and direct and carrying everything he could not say all at once. "Stay long enough," he said quietly. "That the house stops being quiet in the wrong way." Clara stood in the doorway of his study for a moment. The morning light was coming through the small window, landing on the leather folder on his desk. "I intend to," she said, and she walked out into the hall, where somewhere at the far end, she could already hear Thomas moving around. His footsteps unassisted now, light and purposeful and belonging to a boy who had decided the world was worth walking through. Spring came to Cutter Ranch the way spring always came to that part of New Mexico, quietly and then all at once. The dry scrub brush put out small flowers, pale purple and yellow, and the sky turned a color of blue that seemed almost invented. The mornings smelled of warming rock and something green underneath, and the hawks that had circled all winter in dark patience were suddenly everywhere, riding currents of warm air above the ridge. Thomas Cutter walked to school. Not every day, the town was 4 miles by the trail, and Santos took him on the rougher mornings. But on the clear days, with his boots on and his book bag on his back, he walked out of the yard himself and down the trail without looking back. The first time, Clara stood on the porch and watched him go. Elias stood behind her in the doorway. Neither of them said anything. The boy didn't look back because he didn't need to. He already knew they were there. Clara never did leave. Not at the end of the month. Not at the end of winter. By the time the spring wildflowers came, she had a different room, her own desk, her own shelf for books, Her own window where she sat in the early mornings and wrote her letters. Different letters now to different people. Sometimes to Reverend Calloway, who wrote back long, warm replies in careful old man handwriting. Sometimes to nurses she'd worked with in other towns, in other lives. Elias read them still. But now she knew. Now she left them where he could find them. And sometimes she wrote things in them that were for his eyes. Small, ordinary things. A description of the morning light. A thought she'd had at the Overlook. A line about a man who had learned to sit in the quiet without drowning in it. He never mentioned those lines directly. But sometimes, after reading, he would find her in whatever room she was in, and he would stand near her for a moment, just near her, not demanding anything, and the silence between them was the right kind. The kind that has something in it. Thomas, in the spring of that year, named a star. It was one without an official name. He checked 3 different star charts the way he checked everything 3 times. He named it Maggie. He didn't make an announcement about it. He just told Clara one night on the porch, pointing up into the thick New Mexico star field, and she looked where he pointed. Right there, he said. That one. Between those 2 bright ones. It's beautiful, she said. She was loud, he said. So I picked a bright one. Clara put her hand on his shoulder. He leaned into it just slightly, the way children do when they want comfort but also want you to know they're fine. She thought, this house is not quiet anymore in the wrong way. She thought, imagine what you can find when you open a letter from a stranger. What would you have done if a letter like that had arrived for you? The desert keeps its secrets in the dust. But some things, some stubborn, quiet, inevitable things, find their way to the light no matter how long the dark has lasted.